So hello and thank you for tuning into this talk. My name is Peter Rood. I'll be presenting a number of aspects of the Impact and Fiction project, and what I present is joint work with my colleagues Olivia Fialho, Marijn Kolen, Ole Moesman, Julia Neugarten, Joris van Zundert and Willem van Hagen. And I'll start by introducing a number of aspects of the project.
The project's research question is, how do properties of fiction books impact on different types of readers? How do they affect readers? That's a quite general question. How are we going to approach it? Well, through an agreement with the Dutch National Library and Dutch publishers, we have access to the full text of about 10,000 Dutch novels. We also scraped about 500,000 and counting Dutch reviews from online reviewing sites such as Goodreads, bol.com, which is the most important Dutch online bookseller, hebban.nl, which is a Goodreads-like site, and a number of smaller sites. We also have metadata about those reviews, and we have information about readers also downloaded from those sites. So we use naturally occurring data. We can't do experimentation. Strictly speaking, we will not be able to make any causal claims as a result of this project, but of course we do hope to find strong and interesting correlations. How do we operationalize the concepts in the research question? So what do we see as impact? What are the properties of the books that we want to look at? And what do we mean by a type of reader? Well, first of all, impact. In digital humanities computational work, often impact is operationalized as popularity or rating, a number of downloads. We want to go a bit further than that. Initially, what we're going to use is the impact model defined by Marijn Kolen and myself, where we distinguish 4 categories of impact: emotion, narrative feeling, stylistic feeling, and reflection. We deduce those impact factors from the text of the reviews based on a model containing terms and phrases that may occur in the reviews. Later, we hope to be using a reading experience inventory, which we are still developing and that I'll be talking about in a minute. With respect to the book properties, again, in lots of computational work, the approach to book properties may be a bit simple and not really very interesting from the perspective of the reader or the literary researcher. Often they're looking at things like word frequencies or part of speech tags, etc. What we want to do is to look at topic, mood, style, narrative pace, and attractiveness of characters. Well, how we're going to operationalize those is a next question, which would take us too far at this moment. Finally, reader type. Our initial idea was that we would be defining reader types based on their preferences, on their book and genre preferences, as we can deduce it from the book lists that they create and the type of books that they review and read and rate, etc. Maybe we'll be going for something more psychologically meaningful, but that's also something that we're still working on. Finally, I want to say one thing about how this project is funded. It's funded by the Netherlands eScience Center. It's a 3-year project. I think the scheme is pretty unique. They provide us with money to hire postdoc and also with in-kind scholarly programmer hours. So the programmers are employed at the Netherlands eScience Center but deployed within our project. They are mostly scholars themselves. They usually have PhDs, so they can actually help us think about the research questions. And the idea of this scheme is that the computational knowledge that is produced in the project and the programs that are produced flow back into the national infrastructure, national research infrastructure of the country. So for the overview, we have books, we have reader, reviewers, and we have the reviews that they produce. For the books, we have low-level features such as post tags and word frequencies and parse trees. We have the high-level features such as mood and style that we hope to deduce from the low-level features. We have book metadata such as the genre and even the publisher that is publishing a book. We have metadata about the reviewers, and for the reviews, we have the reading impact model to start with and the impact scores that the model predicts. We may do some annotation to have extra information about the reviews that's not so easily deducible from the text. And we have review metadata, such as the rating and the date of the review. We bring all these data together into either statistical inference or machine learning tools with the aim of predicting the review characteristics and especially the impacts from the book characteristics and especially the reviewer characteristics. A note of caution, of course, it's not just the book text that determines the impact on the reader. Social factors may be just as important. We don't really know. For instance, even the genre or the publisher is a social factor that may also be relevant. And then there's the way the book is positioned, people who like it or don't like it, maybe the way it's featured in a television program, etc., which can also have influence on how a book is appreciated by a reader. So there'll be unavoidably lots of unexplained variants. Let's hope that there will also be some variants that we can explain within the project. So I'll be showing two things that we're working on. And I think that beyond their intrinsic interest, for us as a team, they're also important because it's part of a process of aligning our very different research backgrounds. First of all, we're looking whether we can see in the online review some of the characteristics of reading that have been found in empirical reading studies. And for this, we go back to Olivia Fialho's thesis, which distinguished 4 types of reading illustrated in these pictures. And I'll be describing those stages or types very colloquially. You see that in the, let's say, more superficial types, reader and text stay closely or stay clearly separated. In the what's called SF enactment, reader and text come closer together, but in the higher stages there's actually a merging between reader and text. And the interesting thing is that one of the findings of Olivia was that this is also expressed in respondents' discourse, especially in the deixis of their texts, in the personal pronouns that they use, and also in the mental state verbs that occur. But with respect to the personal pronouns, what we see is that in the more superficial stages, there are mostly first and third person pronouns. In the merging types, there's also a combination of first and second person pronouns. And that's one of the things that we're going to look for in the online reviews. So we are going to look at the use of features that we know differentiate reading types, such as personal pronouns. And with respect to verbs, what we'd like to do is Halliday's grammar of experience, but for this there's no tool in Dutch. What there is, however, is the referentiebestand Nederlands, and it associates verbs with their semantic type in terms of action, process, and state. So that's at least something. So we've done a number of preliminary analysis, checking to what extent the platforms that we downloaded our reviews from are comparable. More specifically, what their differences are in terms of the pronoun types and the verb types. For the pronoun types, for the person types, we see some slight differences. Bol.com, the bookseller, uses more first and second person pronouns, less third person pronouns. Goodreads, the Dutch Goodreads reviews, use more first person pronouns and less third person pronouns, but it's nothing spectacular. With respect to the verb types, we see that really their usage is across all platforms very consistent. Then we also check to what extent the fractions of pronouns and other words depend on the length of the review and the platform. And what you see in this slide is the fraction of first person pronouns in the total number of words with their standard deviations on the y-axis as a function of the length of the reviews on the x-axis displayed logarithmically on the various platforms. And you see that in the very short reviews, there's no room for pronouns. Then the fraction increases until roughly 2%. Then again, it decreases a bit, but not too much. For some of the platforms, there's some movement at the end of the graph, but that's really because there's not too much data for these smaller platforms. And in fact, this is true for most words or word types. The fraction mostly remains constant after, let's say, 50 or 100 words. So for the personal pronoun types, one of the things that we can do is look at verbs that they occur most and least often with. As you see, for the first person, it's often about the process of ordering the book, about expectations for the event in the book or for the next book. For the third person, in Dutch, these are mostly impersonal constructions. It finishes well, it goes wrong, it brings along. But for the second person, that's the most interesting. It's you imagine yourself in, you get absorbed into the book, you sympathize with. So it's really interesting to note that the second person pronoun comes together with verbs typical of vivid imagination, of absorption, etc. And that's supporting the idea that the use of the inclusive second person pronoun indicates a sense of merging between the self and textual other. So what we see in this slide is by length of the review, again on a logarithmic scale, the correlations between the personal pronoun person types. And what I want to focus on in this slide is the blue bars. So that's the correlation between first and second person pronouns. What we see that for lower lengths, the types are in competition and a sentence can have only one subject, so therefore all the correlations are negative. However, when the length of the review becomes greater, what we see is a correlation between first and second person pronouns, and that can be seen as another indication of the blending between reader and text that was also suggested by the verb usage. And so our preliminary findings seems to show that we can apply the findings from the analysis of in-depth reader response, as Olivia did in her thesis, to the analysis of the online book reviews. So this looks very promising, I think. To further characterize online readers and reading experiences, we're developing a reading typology. As I mentioned, for the initial impact analysis, we have a simple model based on the framework of Koopman and Hakemulder, but we really need more nuance than that. The responses in the reviews are really varied, and therefore we are building an inventory of possible responses, top-down from existing literature and bottom-up from what we see in the reviews. At the moment, a draft of that inventory is done. We're doing a check within the project to see whether it's complete and clearly defined, and check whether we have enough examples and counterexamples of the various categories. So this inventory is heavily based on Olivia's earlier work, the Transformative Reading Inventory. And the inventory consists of 4 main categories: evaluative engagement, narrative engagement, aesthetic engagement, and reflection. Evaluative engagement, so that's defined as including evaluations and judgments towards the text, such as the overall enjoyment, pleasure or satisfaction of reading a fictional book. It's among others based on Mijl and Kuiken 2002, and it consists of 3 subcategories: evaluation of book, of characters and of authors. And for each of the categories, where appropriate, we include features, agency, so that's who is doing the evaluation in terms of reader, text, or a merging of reader and text, valence, so is the evaluation positive or negative, and intensity, so is the evaluation strong or weak. The second main category is narrative engagement, defined as engagement towards specific aspects of the fictional event sequence, such as empathy with a character or resonance with the mood of a story, of a setting. And we distinguish empathy, so a combination of experiences of the reader's own inner world and those of the characters in the story; sympathy, a feeling for others; absorption, attention, transportation, emotional engagement and mental imagery; flow, the state where one finds concentration and happiness while performing a challenging activity that one is capable of; and finally, story-driven reading, an approach where the reader is focused on plot or storyline with particular emphasis on interesting action and compelling conclusions. For the third category, aesthetic engagement, we don't include subcategories. We define it as evaluations and judgments of the sentence, imagery, language, textile, narrative construction, and genre, including defamiliarizing responses and other responses such as sense of importance, beauty, and discussion value of the work. The last category is reflection. It's a group with the largest number of subcategories, and I'm not going to define all of them for you. This is also the category where we find most of the bottom-up phenomena not covered in, for instance, the transformative reading inventory. For instance, lots of reviews mention whether the text is hard to read or easy to read, so text comprehension. Positive or negative recommendations are a very frequent element in reviews, and what we also encountered quite a lot is dialogical reading, so a reviewer engaging in dialogue with other reviewers. The tool that we're using for checking our category system and that we'll also use for structured annotation later is called Inception. Inception is an open source and very powerful annotation tool with lots of import and export facilities. You can install it on a server. It facilitates the definition of many different types of annotation, though there are also a number of default annotations available. It includes a curation view, which shows annotations from multiple users in a single view, so that's very useful for getting to see whether we all understand the same thing by a certain annotation type, so a certain category. I'm showing you a slide with one review, and I've highlighted one annotation in orange. The text is "Wat een geweldig boek is dit?" So that's "What a great book this is." In the right margin, we see the type of the annotation. This one is evaluative engagement with the text. The annotated text, "Wat een geweldig boek is dit?" And also the applicable features. So the agency is set to other because it's an impersonal formulation. There's no involvement of the self. The intensity is set to high because it's geweldig, a great book. And the valence, of course, is positive because it's a positive statement about the book. From the application of the inventory categories to the reviews, we want to develop a typology of the reviews. And the method that we hope to apply could be called automated LexNap. LexNap is the method that Olivia Fialho designed in her thesis. It means lexical basis for numerically aided phenomenology. And it consists of defining constituents, sort of template phrases or short summaries for categories in the inventory. And these might have the form of "I was X at the character." So I was angry at this person, or reader feels sad for the character. Then to create a matrix of possible constituents on the one axis and reading reports on the other axis, then by a clustering procedure create clusters of reports and then try to understand that cluster. Our idea now is to add an annotation stage where we annotate a largest set of reviews using the inventory and the defined constituents. Then we apply machine learning, where the computer learns the characteristics of the texts and also generates more relevant constituents. And then we continue with the clustering of the reviews, and hopefully that results in meaningful and interpretable clusters of online reviews. Finally, this is what our work program looks like. In the coming year, we will work on a reading typology and clustering of readers, then look at book topic and mood and their effect on impact. Until 2024, we extend the analysis to book style, pace, and character likability, and then create a joint model of all the factors that we have analyzed and their effect on impact. I should say that when I made this slide, I asked myself whether it's really possible to do all of this in this short amount of time. Well, we'll see, and stay tuned.
So, thank you very much for listening to this video. If you want to know more, please visit https://impactandfiction.huygens.knaw.nl. It may be interesting that soon we'll be advertising for a vacancy, a postdoc, in empirical literary studies. I'm afraid Dutch will be required, so that'll limit the audience, but still, spread the word. and then I'd like to take your questions. Thanks.